Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am here talking on behalf of Dr. Falendra Kumar Sudan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Jammu. I am going to talk about the module Linkages between Population Dynamics and Sustainable Development from Demography of Climate Adaptation. So students, we are going to discuss about the linkages between population dynamics and sustainable development within a human rights based framework to address related challenges and seize opportunities. In 2011, the world population exceeded the 7 billion mark and it will continue to grow in future. In current scenario, one of the greatest challenges is to improve the well-being of growing population. At the same time, it is essential to ensure the sustainable use of limited natural resources. The linkage between sustainable development and population dynamics was acknowledged by the Rio Declaration at the United Nations. According to the Principle 1 of Rio Declaration, human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. The Principle 8 of Rio Declaration targets to achieve sustainable development and a higher quality of life for all people. States should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and promote appropriate demographic policies. Similarly, the Principle 6 of ICPD Program of Action, Chapter 2, highlights that sustainable development as a means to ensure human well-being, equitably shared by all people today and in the future, requires that the interrelationships between population, resources, the environment, and development should be fully recognized, appropriately managed, and brought into harmonious dynamic balance. To achieve sustainable development and a higher quality of life for all people, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and promote appropriate policies, including population-related policies, in order to meet the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Hence, this module aims to explain the linkages between population dynamics and sustainable development and to outline a human rights-based framework to address the related challenges and seize opportunities. Development and human well-being. The development means the search of a better life and to improve human well-being. The measures of human well-being are the elimination of poverty and food insecurity, access to adequate clothing and housing, the enjoyment of health and education, and more generally, capabilities and functionings. Whatever is the measure of human well-being, it is related to the enjoyment of goods and services. The human well-being is more than the satisfaction of material needs and desire. The well-being is most essentially dependent on the consumption of goods and services. The sufficient consumption does not only need a more balanced distribution of economic resources, but is also dependent on higher level of production. Social progress and improvements in human well-being is dependent on higher levels of economic output. Higher economic output will put pressures on all natural resources, that is the land, forests, groundwater, oceans, and the climate. The wrong patterns of consumption and production put undue pressure on natural resources. This would eventually weaken the very basis for economic growth and social progress. There is no denying the fact that social progress requires higher economic output, but it is to be ensured that it does not endanger the environmental sustainability. Determinants of environmental impact of human activity. Various efforts are needed for sustainable development strategies. The efforts to ameliorate the situation are strongly influenced by population dynamics. There are three principal determinants which explain the environmental impact of human activity. They are the rate of economic growth, the rate of technological progress, and the rate of population growth. These determinants are recognized by the Rio and Kyoto international political declarations. Despite the recognition of these determinants, past policies and the current debate have not adequately addressed these determinants and their interlinkages. Other aspects of population dynamics, such as changes in age structures and spatial distributions of population, have received even less attention. The main reasons for this are: number one, there is a belief that population problem has already been solved due to the fact that population growth rates have been declining in most of the countries in the last 2 decades. Number two, the worry that some of the past policies implemented to influence population dynamics infringed on fundamental human rights and freedoms. And number three, the understanding of the issues related with the ICPD program of action. Now we can discuss the population agenda and sustainable development. In many developing countries, there are apprehensions about reproductive health policies in the context of high population growth. There have been major concerns with regard to the population dynamics amongst policymakers in these nations. About 2/3 of the governments of the least developed countries have expressed major concerns with high population growth, high fertility, and rapid urbanization. Therefore, there is a need to recognize various factors to bring back the population agenda into the sustainable development debate. These factors are highlighted as under. Population dynamics have an important pressure on sustainable development. Efforts to promote sustainable development not addressing population dynamics will continue to fail, and population dynamics is influenced by a set of policies which respect human rights and freedoms. It also adds to a reduction in fertility, notably access to sexual and reproductive health care, education beyond the primary level, and the empowerment of women. There is need to restore the significance of population dynamics in the Sustainable Development Agenda, which has been lost over the past decades. Population dynamics and its implications for sustainable development. The world population has already crossed the mark of 7 billion in 2011. According to recent population projections, the world population will grow over 9 billion by 2050. By 2050, the additions to the world population will be equal to the population inhabited the planet in 1950. However, demographic change in the medium and long term is not fate. The growth of population will depend on the policies that the countries pursue today. The failure to reach replacement level of fertility implies continued population growth in the coming decades. The life expectancy has been increasing globally. The fertility rates have been falling in most of the developing world, with some exceptions of the LDCs. Even if the fertility falls immediately to replacement level, the population would continue to grow for some time. Due to high fertility in the past, many countries now have a relatively large number of women in the reproductive age. Even if each woman has a relatively small number of children, these countries will continue to have a growing population for years to come. Thus, today's decisions have long-term implications in the term of population. Individual choices and opportunities are important to population dynamics. Population dynamics are best addressed by expanding, not by restricting, individual choices and opportunities. The rights and policies must focus on the empowerment of the individuals. The human-centered and right-based policies are needed to control the growing population. The access to sexual and reproductive health care, providing education beyond the primary level with a focus on girls, and the empowerment of women is also necessary. The efforts made in this direction contribute to an improved quality of life. They help to reduce teenage pregnancies and lower infant, child, and maternal mortality. They also help to lower fertility, slow population growth, and support more sustainable development. The planned families are taken for granted in developed world. In developing countries, there are about 200 million women who continue to lack access to sexual and reproductive health care. The family planning is an essential and integral aspect of women empowerment. The decisions regarding the number of children and time when to have children are most important and fundamental and consequential decisions of anybody's life. It affects the people's health and education and can influence their participation in economic, social, and political life, their earnings, and their living. Population growth and environmental pressures. Out of the total population of 7 billion, more than 1 billion continue to live in extreme poverty. These people suffer from food insecurity and live in slums. Millions are unable to find productive and remunerative employment. In order to meet the people's needs, there is need for more balanced distribution of economic resources. It also depends on higher levels of economic output. Food insecurity means the lack of capacity to purchase food in the market spaces. Food insecurity is still largely a question of access. It is also rapidly becoming a question of availability. The capacity of the agriculture sector to produce sufficient quantities of food is also questionable. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the world agricultural output will need to grow by no less than 70% to feed a population of 9 billion by 2050. The poverty reduction, employment generation, and food security will depend on rising economic output in agriculture and outside agriculture. The rising economic output will also increase pressures on natural resources. Currently, more and more countries are suffering from rapid degradation of land, a high rate of deforestation, and water shortages. Climate change further contributes to an increasing concentration and frequency of natural disasters, changes in precipitation and droughts. Mostly the poor who directly depend on the natural resources are most exposed to these changes and least able to cope with these changes. The worst sufferers are often the women and children. The discrimination of women, older persons, indigenous communities, and migrant workers can further worsen these challenges. The patterns of production and consumption are more important than the numbers of people in achieving a world that sustains present and future generations. But at the same time, the rising expectations and poverty reduction efforts will put additional pressure on the planet resources unless we can find more efficient, greener ways to provide all people with decent living. The future of population depends on quickly lowering greenhouse gas emissions. The conversion to the green economy requires fiscal incentives and disincentives as well as environmental laws and regulations. These are necessary to encourage the internalization of environmental costs. There is need to place a more sensible price on essential and limited natural resources. Environmental impact can also be reduced through more precise product standards to reduce the packaging of products, eliminate plastic bags in supermarkets, set emission targets for vehicles, set insulation standards for buildings, etc. More careful consumer behavior like shut off appliances that are not in use, turn off car engines on curbsides, use public transport when possible, prevent excessive cooling and heating of buildings, etc. are also essential. At the same time, there is a need to promote the development of alternative, renewable, and clean energy sources and encourage the use and development of resource-efficient technologies. Finally, a more balanced distribution of economic resources could reduce poverty. In this sense, greater social equity together with slower population growth can also produce environmental pressures. Population growth and mounting pressures. There are considerable differences in the growth of population between countries. Over the past decades, the differences in population growth have increased considerably. In developed countries, the populations are stabilizing or declining, and population growth is decelerating in the middle income countries, and at the same time, population growth remains high in the LDCs. The population growth is lower in the LDCs of Asia than in the LDCs of Africa. Due to high population growth, the LDCs have a large and rapidly expanding youth population. Currently, about 60% of their population is under the age of 25. By 2050, the youth population will increase by an additional 60%. The large and growing youth population is most significant productive resource in the LDCs. They contribute most to economic development, provided they benefit from good health, adequate education, and employment. In the LDCs, rapid economic development is required to maintain per capita spending in health, education, and to create employment opportunities for youth. During next 40 years, the population of the LDCs is expected to double. The working age population will increase by about 15 million persons per year, and their labor force will expand by about 33,000 persons per year. They will pose a severe challenge. About 50% of the population lives in extreme poverty, and 80% of the labor force in LDCs is vulnerably employed. Unemployment is particularly high amongst youth. Many recent graduates find only low-paying and unstable employment in the informal economy. The LDCs require higher and more sustainable economic growth to create full employment, raise household incomes, and poverty reduction. However, achieving higher economic growth in LDCs will put increasing pressure on environmental resources. This is particularly true when economic growth is based on extractive and carbon-intensive industries. Besides, agriculture production also erodes natural resources in LDCs. Therefore, environmental degradation has more negative effects on LDCs than developing countries. This, along with high population growth, affects their prospects for economic development. The real economic growth in the LDCs was almost as high as in other developing countries. Between 2000 and 2008, it was about 6.6% per annum on average. But adjusted for environmental effects and population growth, the real rate of economic growth was almost half of what it was in other developing countries, about 2.5% per annum. The combined environmental effects and high population growth weaken the capacity of the LDCs to catch up with the income levels of the more advanced developing countries on a sustainable basis. Human activities have already affected every country and have altered the world's climate. The poor populations of the LDCs are most negatively affected by its effects. They also suffer from an unsustainable pattern of agriculture production and forestry management. All this contributes to water depletion and soil degradation and gradually undermines their livelihoods. All, including the poorest, are seriously concerned with the depletion and degradation of natural resources. Population growth and rapid urbanization. The world is experiencing the largest wave of urban growth in history. Over half of the world's population is living in towns and cities. By 2030, this number will swell to almost 5 billion. The world is likely to experience one of the most important demographic changes in the coming decades. Currently, the share of urban population in the LDCs is low. The rate of urban population growth is very high at about 4% per annum. Rural-urban migration in LDCs is motivated by economic opportunities, which is also closely linked to changing environmental conditions. For example, flooding in the delta of Bangladesh and droughts in the Horn of Africa threaten livelihoods in the rural areas and encourage many to search for a more prosperous life in the urban centers. Migration can be a strategy to adapt to changing environmental conditions rather than the failure to adapt. The changes in spatial distributions of population due to environmental impacts are going to increase human vulnerabilities. Though the majority of the world's poor still live in the rural areas, but the number of poor people who live in the urban areas is rapidly growing. Nearly about 1 billion people live in urban slums, which lack basic services such as clean water and sanitation. The rapid growth in urban areas can impose serious threats to the environment through urban sprawl. They are also associated with an increasing consumption of resources, including water. However, the increase in consumption is attributable largely to a small share of households with high income levels. Urban slums residents are also exposed to environmental vulnerability. People are living in places at risk of climate change impacts and other environmental hazards. The pollution levels are generally much higher, which is worsening many health risks. Low-lying cities and towns situated near the sea will face sharp risks from storm surges and flooding. Those in dry lands are prone to experience increased water stress and episodes of extreme heat. The capacity to handle with these risks is lower in small and medium cities and towns where incomes are low and protective infrastructure is lacking. In spite of the urbanization challenges, it can be a powerful driver for sustainable economic, social, and environmental development. Urbanization facilitates countries to provide important services, including health and education, at lower costs per capita and also allows for economies of scale in the development of vital infrastructure, including housing, water, sanitation, and transport. Urbanization can also decrease energy consumption, particularly in transport and housing, and it can help to alleviate population pressures in rural areas. The urban planning calls for providing more employment, land, and housing to the growing urban poor. The suitable policy response to rapid urbanization is essential. Population growth in urban areas is mostly due to natural population increase. Most of the One of the most efficient ways to slow urban growth is to reduce unwanted fertility in both rural and urban areas. The efforts are made to improve the lives of the growing number of urban poor. The development of urban areas and industries must be complemented to reduce poverty and promote the development of rural areas. The strong backwards and forward linkages between rural and urban areas are the backbone of strong development. The changes in size of population are certainly bringing about change in the age structure of population. There is no denying the fact that countries having high population growth have youthful populations and the countries with low population growth have an aging population. Changing age structures affect the only patterns of consumption and production, but also affect the balance between returns to and investment in the different factors of production. There are important implications for labor market, wages and income distribution, as well as current and future output. The effect of age structural changes on the environment is multifaceted and strongly depends on the effects of these changes on overall economic growth. If aging societies manage to grab the second demographic bonus, or if youthful societies manage to grab the first demographic bonus, it can contribute to economic growth and social development. There is a need for strong investment in human capital alongside investment in physical and natural capital. The consequences of reaping the demographic bonuses on the environment depend on policy choices to transition to the green economy and sustainable development pathways. To conclude, changes in population size have important implications for sustainable development. Now let us discuss about certain policy implications. The challenges of population growth and environmental sustainability are most prominent in the LDCs of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. These challenges have serious policy implications that demand globally coordinated responses. Efforts are being made to meet rapidly growing demand for water, food, and energy. In case the countries fail to meet people's needs, reduce poverty, raise living standards, and ensure greater equity, it will threaten sustainability, security, and stability throughout the world. Therefore, there is need to reduce poverty and improve well-being and living standards. Population dynamics affect not only economic development objectives but also have a strong impact on the social, economic, and environmental aspects of sustainable development. Eliminating food security and hunger, ensuring a sustainable use of land, forests, oceans, and ground, ensuring universal access to clean, safe, and affordable energy, building sustainable and livable cities and communities, and reducing natural and man made disasters are strongly linked to population dynamics. Efforts made by countries to promote sustainable development cannot succeed as long as these remain dissociated from the knowledge and policy options linked to population dynamics. There is need to address challenges associated with population dynamics and promote more sustainable pathways of development which not only respect but strengthen human rights and freedoms and support human development. Incentives can address population dynamics by enlarging rather than restricting individual choices and opportunities, better access to healthcare services, help in reducing the child and maternal mortality rate, and arrest the spread of communicable diseases. It also helps to contribute the empowerment of women and falling fertility levels. Proper access to sexual and reproductive health care is particularly important in LDCs, which continue to have high fertility and large unmet needs for family planning. LDCs must empower women by providing adequate access to sexual and reproductive health care. There is a need to empower women to promote their active participation in economic, social, and political life. Many women continue to spend a considerable share of their time fetching firewood and water. There are important activities which support the well being of households, but they are not commercially valued activities. As a result, many women cannot participate in the formal economy due to which they lack an independent income. Women who lack education and economic opportunities often have more children, and because they have more children, many women lack education and economic opportunities. This is a poverty trap, in fact. Such poverty traps must be broken through important policies. LDCs must recognize, cultivate, and grab the powerful potential of youth population. There is need to fulfill their ambition of high standards of living. The immediate interest of younger generations is to achieve material well-being and independence. Younger generations have a longer life expectancy and a natural interest in the long-term environmental sustainability. They are the custodians of the future. In order to support the empowerment and participation of youth population, it is important to promote sustainable development and green economies. Social security measures must target the most vulnerable populations. Without higher economic growth, the scope of social transfers in the poorest countries is limited. There are many competing demands on very limited financial resources of these countries. Therefore, external support is necessary for social security programs. So, students, let us sum up what we have learned from this module. To sum up, it can be stated that there is a need for a systematic use of available population data and projections for advanced planning. If countries prepare proper plans and pursue appropriate policies, urbanization and youth bulges are more likely to become positive drivers of economic, social, and environmental development. Thus, promoting human well-being and raising standards of living are not only sources of development but are also important means to address population dynamics and promote more sustainable development pathways. The policies that promote human development and address population dynamics, together with policies that encourage higher, sustained, and environmentally sustainable economic growth, must constitute the cornerstones of sustainable development strategies. That's all with this lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.